Now, according to a report from All Africa, Africa is facing three major red alert situations that are expected to get even worse in 2026. In Sudan, the war is hitting a grim 1,000-day milestone, leaving millions of people starving and displaced while world leaders scramble to figure out how to stop the flow of outside weapons. Meanwhile, in West African countries like Mali and Burkina Faso, extremist groups are literally choking off cities by blocking fuel and food supplies, putting the governments there on the verge of total collapse. Over in the Horn of Africa, things are just as tense between Ethiopia and Eritrea. Old grudges and fights over sea access have reached a boiling point, and with Eritrea recently walking away from regional peace talks, there's a real fear that a massive multi-country war could break out. Essentially, the situation has shifted from concerning to catastrophic, and without some serious boots on the ground diplomacy this year, the humanitarian toll is going to be staggering. Now, joining us to make sense of this, we have Paul Mali, Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House in London, UK. And we also have Dr. Fatele Olaleye, Lecturer, Peace and Conflict Studies in Noun University, Nigeria. Thank you so much, gentlemen, for your time and for staying with us.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be with you.
It's a pleasure. Now, let's get straight to it. Let me begin with Paul Mali. Paul, let's begin with you. Now, over in West Africa, the Al-Qaeda-linked JNIM has effectively strangled Mali's capital, Bamako, with a month-long fuel blockade. So if the lifeline of the country is cut, are we looking at the total collapse, a total state collapse, rather than just a military defeat?
Well, we really don't know at this stage. It looks quite uncertain because although JNIM have the capacity to cut the supply routes, particularly the key routes from the port of Dakar in Senegal and the port of Abidjan in Côte d'Ivoire, which are the key axes for bringing fuel to Mali, which doesn't have its own oil reserves or oil production. It's less certain that JNIM would have the capacity to actually take over the city of Bamako and impose a new political regime. That would be a huge challenge. Bamako is a quite spread out city of somewhere between 3 million, possibly up to 5 million if you allow the outer areas population. That would be a vast and difficult security challenge. So it looks as if, for the moment, JNIM is content to maintain constant pressure through attacks on fuel tanker convoys on those two key routes. And that gives it a strong bargaining position. It puts the government on the defensive. But whether it would be enough to actually bring down the government seems rather questionable, because to actually take over power in Mali would be a much, much bigger ask. And it's not clear that JNIM has that capacity, or even in the short term, that wish. They may instead be hoping that the pressure they can exert either forces the regime into some sort of deal or negotiation, or else produces internal ructions or pressures within the military.
Okay, now let's come to Dr. Olaleye. Dr. Olaleye, if you can hear me, let's speak on Sudan. We know that Sudan is now the site of the world's largest displacement crisis, with over 12 million people forced from their homes. Now, after nearly 1,000 days of fighting, would you say that this conflict has simply become a war without limits, as the ICRC warns, where the very concept of civilian safety has been erased?
Good evening, and thank you for having me. With respect to Sudan, our Sudanese identity, politics, and ethnic division have actually been a central factor in perpetrating violence. You see, discrimination based on ethnicity and religion, and in that region has excluded large sections of population from political participation and economic benefit. And this has, to a great extent, fueled tensions in almost part of Sudan. And similarly, in the Horn of Africa, the issue of national identity and historical grievances, until some of these things are addressed between the ethnic groups, especially in Ethiopia, remain deeply ingrained. You know, Eritrean nationalism combined with Ethiopia's federal system that grant ethnic groups autonomy continue to be a point of friction between the two nations. And we also see weak institutions and corruption. Of course, we can't overflow the issue of corruption. Economic struggles and resource competitions are also things that fuel from time to time this Sudan issue, among other things.
Okay. Now, let's come back to you, Paul. Paul, going back to West Africa, you know, analysts are now calling Mali Africa's Afghanistan, with jihadists controlling more territory than ever. Is the Malian junta's reliance on Russia's Africa core actually accelerating the country's fragmentation?
You can certainly make an argument for that, but I think there are a couple of other elements. There's no doubt that the Africa Corps, or rather the track record of its preceding military operation, the Wagner private military contractor, and we're not quite clear what proportion of the former Wagner personnel have simply, as it were, been relabeled as Africa Corps. But that Russian presence in some ways certainly contributed to the crisis, because they have a very poor human rights record, and that has alienated or deepened the alienation of sections of the population, and it may actually, in some cases, even have pushed some people to join JNIM or other armed groups. But there's also a second factor which has accelerated the crisis, which is the decision of the current government in Mali to abandon the 2015 peace agreement that had been made with the Tuareg groups in the north. And those groups are not jihadist, and they had reached, although they were originally campaigning for independence, they had reached an agreement basically on decentralization and a degree of autonomy for the north. And more or less, that peace agreement had held since 2015. But after the dispute between Mali and the military regime in Mali and France, and the withdrawal of the French, and then Mali's demand that the United Nations peacekeeping force in the country pull out as well, the government in Bamako launched a really vigorous military offensive to push into the north. Basically, it abandoned the peace agreement, and by putting a chunk of its military effort into the far north, into a region where which had been broadly peaceful, although there was still occasional violence incidents, it's spread its military reach very far. It's spread its security resources over a huge area, and that's reduced its capacity to tackle the security problems in the center of the country, and allowed some military scope, if you like, for this big jihadist push into the south that has now cut Bamako's key supply routes.
So what about the fact that, you know, in July 2024, we actually saw the Tinzawatan massacre? It really shows that the Russians can also be beaten. Is the junta's survival now tied to foreign mercenary group, you know, that may not have the numbers or even the interest to save Bamako? What more can they do?
Well, I think that incident at Tinzawatan, which is right up on the Algerian border in the middle of the Sahara Desert, that illustrates exactly the point I'm making, that essentially that was a region that was broadly peaceful, not very secure, but more or less peaceful, under the agreement with the Tuareg nationalists. But that Tinzawatan incident was basically part of the revival of the government's campaign against the Tuareg nationalist movements. And by relaunching that war and then suffering the Tinzawatan defeat, the government's position was weakened. And as you say, it showed the limits of what the Russians could do. They suffered very heavy casualties. But there's also a simple numbers point. Nobody's exactly sure, but the general estimate is that Wagner and now Africa Corps, that represents something between 1,000 and 2,000 personnel. Now, if you contrast that with the position before, when Mali had a security partnerships with France and with the UN, the French, out of their deployment across the whole of the Sahel, they probably had between 2,000 and 3,000 troops in Mali. And meanwhile, the UN force had somewhere around 13,000, 14,000, I think the figure was. So you add those together, you're talking about, say, 16,000 troops. And clearly a Russian force of 1,000 or 2,000 isn't remotely going to be able to fill the gap that those other forces filled. And also, as you hinted, it has its own agenda. Wagner certainly had significant commercial interest in gold mining in Mali and was obviously allocating some of its resources to the protection of that.
Okay, so when we actually come back, to you, we'll link it to the 5,000 military troop units that the AES, has actually formed. Now let's come back to Dr. Olaleye. Going back to Sudan, the IPC Phase 5 famine is no longer a risk. It is a reality in Darfur and Kordofan, especially with 21 million people facing acute food insecurity. Who are we watching the deliberate use of starvation as a weapon of war by both the SAF and the RSF? Dr. Olaleye, if you can hear me. All right, so I think Dr. Olaleye is frozen. We'll try to reconnect with him. Coming back to you, Paul. So we're talking about, the formation of the 5,000 troops of the by the AES. That's Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger. Now, the UN has actually warned of a disastrous domino effect across West Africa, especially if Bamako actually falls. So what does that mean for coastal states like, Ghana, Ivory Coast? Is the jihadist corridor now an inevitability? What are your thoughts on the formation of the troops as well?
Well, I think it's not an inevitability, but it's a serious worry because although the AES has announced this regional force of 5,000 troops, remember that we don't yet know whether that is in any respect different from the original force of actually 5,000 troops formed by the G5 Sahel when it existed, before the wave of military coups. And that force basically drawing units from all 5 member states. Of course, Mauritania and Chad were also in the G5, together with Mali, Burkina, and Niger. It faced quite serious operating problems, really practical things like integrating the different communication systems of the armies of the countries. At one stage, its soldiers had to use their own personal mobile phones to communicate with each other because the radio systems of the different national armies didn't function well together. So although the AES is a more closely integrated group in political terms, there will still be a lot of practicalities to sort out. And it's also not clear whether this 5,000 troop force doesn't actually mean additional troops, or does it simply mean reallocating some of the troops in the existing national armies? It's not clear. And the security situation doesn't seem to be getting any better. Although periodically the armies of all three countries claim various military successes without outside observers. It's very difficult to gauge the reality of the situation on the ground, and the evidence that we do have from the incidents of attacks that occur and the difficulty of maintaining safe, open transport routes linking the major towns would suggest that the situation is very grim. And of course, we're seeing armed groups, jihadist groups, particularly JNAM, but elements of others perhaps, raiding over the borders into the north of coastal states. So Benin in particular has suffered a lot of attacks. There've also been attacks in Togo, in Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and suggestions that some militants have even infiltrated into the north of Ghana. And of course, the security situation in the north of Nigeria, the combination of the internal problems with groups such as ISWAP and Boko Haram, with the overspill of jihadist activity coming from groups operating in the Sahel, that creates a really very difficult security situation. So in some ways, a big question that we wait to see how it will be answered over the coming months of this year is whether the bilateral cooperation, security cooperation that coastal countries such as Ghana and Senegal are beginning to develop with the Sahel states is whether that's going to be translated into a more coordinated regional strategy. Certainly, the message that does seem to be coming from the ECOWAS countries is that although obviously there was a deep political rift following the military coups, and although these three Sahel countries a year ago left ECOWAS, the ECOWAS member states are very willing, very open to try and promote security cooperation. And an interesting sign was that towards the end of last year, although political relations between Côte d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and Burkina Faso had been so difficult, a very senior Ivorian envoy went to Ouagadougou, the Burkina capital, for talks, and there was a warm welcome. So we're starting to see practical cooperation. And of course, Nigeria, with Foreign Minister Tugas' visit to Niger, has also been trying to develop this cooperative approach. And the whole region, Western Africa generally, seems to accept the urgent need to tackle the security issues, even if there are still differences on politics and obviously a lot of difficult issues to still be planned in the shape of the new relationship between the AES bloc and ECOWAS, still to be worked out. But everybody seems from the ECOWAS side to want to cooperate on security, and it will be interesting to see how far the AES states are also open to that collaboration.
Yeah. Well, Paul, just before we wrap up, I would love to have your final thoughts, especially as we look, at the map for 2026. Are we seeing the birth of a new era of permanent war in Africa? And also, is there any solution left for West Africa if the African Union and the UN remain sidelined?
I think the key thing is that discussion that's going on between the ECOWAS and the AES, because West Africa as a whole had a high degree of integration in many different areas, not just in security, but also in trade, in migration, of course, with the free movement possibilities for citizens of the region, infrastructure, energy cooperation, cross-border electricity trade, for example. And of course, we know that the borders at the practical level are often very open. People and trade move across informally, regardless of the formal official rules in force in any one context. So given all that integration, we seem to be reaching a point where governments on all sides are agreed that it's a good idea to try and maintain as much of that practical cooperation as possible, regardless of the differences on politics. And the bitterness that was around the original episodes of the coup d'etat and the obvious political differences over how those were in breach of ECOWAS rules and so on, everybody seems now to be ready to downplay that and, as it were, leave those discussions for another time or a different context and tackle. The question is, can this sort of mood of improved open-mindedness or goodwill, if you like, translate into an actual practical coordinated effort to tackle the security challenges and the related development and political issues at a local level that have to go with that? That's the bit that remains really, really difficult to read. We just don't yet know. Everybody wants to cooperate much more than before on the military side of security. But of course, you have those other dimensions, development and politics. They really do matter to some extent. And that's the bit that it isn't quite clear how that's going to evolve.
All right. Well, thank you so much for your thoughts on this. Paul Mealy, Consulting Fellow, Africa Program, Chatham House in the UK. And we also love to thank Dr. Fatele Olaleye, Lecturer Peace and Conflict Studies from Noun University. Thank you so much once again, Paul.